Hello, everybody. I never know if I should say good afternoon or good morning because we could be anywhere. My name's Cliff Berg. You may know me. So these are the three of us who are hosting this. There are more of us than this, but not a lot more, but there are more of us. And I'd like to introduce Stephen and Howard. And maybe, Stephen, could you say a couple of words about yourself, and then Howard?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I've been involved in, change issues for probably 30 years, from lean manufacturing to Lean Six Sigma, and now to agility. And I bring some practical wisdom from making a lot of mistakes. So nice to see you all here.
Yeah, and that was kind of humble. Stephen actually has had some very interesting roles, including not just Lean Six Sigma, but also HR and a lot of different things. Howard, could you maybe say a couple words?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I've got about 40 years of experience, IT, business, consulting. I've worked in a lot of industries, including consulting, investment banking, mutual funds, motion pictures and television, advertising, and on and on. A great interest in business agility and how execution agility of initiatives and development impacts and enables it.
And Howard, you just published a book.
Well, in a couple of weeks, yes. I wrote a book called Agile Enterprise Risk Management. It's a multidisciplinary study of how to get your company's ability to manage its risks to align with the speed at which you have to operate. And thank you, Cliff, for mentioning that.
Okay. Okay, so some of you might have attended the webinar that we had on the 1st, about 2 weeks ago. And of course, you know, that was the first time we had used the webinar feature of our Zoom account. And so, of course, there was a hiccup at the beginning with some of us not being able to sign in, but that's normal today, it seems. I was giving a keynote actually for DevOps Pro EU a week ago or 2 weeks ago, and the same exact thing happened at the beginning. So that's just, you know, maybe eventually we'll all figure out and get this stuff to work reliably. Anyway, so today's discussion is not a webinar, it's a discussion. It was set up as a meeting, not a webinar, because we wanted to hear from you. The last session was a webinar. We basically talked and you know, explained what we're doing. And but today we want to be more dialogic. So we're going to start out with a very fast, kind of very 10,000, 30,000 foot view of what we talked about last week. We're not going to dive into it, just kind of say, this is what we talked about, this is what we talked about. And then we're going to start in and share some of the questions that we've received and open it up for any questions or discussion.
And before we get started, Cliff,
Yep.
I want to say, if you guys do have questions, you can interrupt us at any time, either by putting a question in the chat box or using the reactions button where you raise your hand. We had an awful lot of action in the chat room last time, and so that's what really prompted us to open up and really set this more up as a dialogue and a discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Stephen. So last time we talked about something called constructive agility, and that's our term. And it comes from the word constructive culture, which is a term in the organizational culture model pioneered by Human Synergistics, which we surveyed a whole range of culture models and selected that one, and we've partnered with them and worked with them to link Agile 2's behaviors to organizational culture, so that we can actually say, and we think we're the only ones who are really speaking to this in a tangible way, what does it mean to have an Agile culture? So agile mindset. Well, we think we know what that means. But anyway, constructive agility is a path for getting there. It's not the only path. But one problem that we see with a lot of these so-called agile frameworks is they kind of tell you, well, this is how you become, this is how you're agile, just do this. And that really doesn't work. It's kind of like telling someone if they want to manage their household and their family, well, just do this and this and this. Well, families are different, so it doesn't work. And what you really need to run an organization well, including to give it agility, is to have experience and knowledge and depth about a lot of different things, including leadership and behavior and plus the business domain and the tech. You have to know these things. And then process will follow. But process is important. But a very important thing is that you actually need to go through the learning that occurs when you define your own process. But you might need guidance for that. But just taking someone else's process from a framework skips the learning, which is the most important step of all. So constructive agility is a kind of path to guide you in creating your own process so that you're not lost in the woods. And using agility, promoting behaviors and ideas and intentionally developing the culture along the way. It turns out we've looked at a number of organizations, and one we've looked very closely at is Spacex for a number of reasons. A key reason in choosing that was it's not a software company, because we feel very much that the ideas of agility they're not unique to software. Hardware and software in different domains, even writing things, these are all on a spectrum in terms of the trade-offs. And it turns out that Spacex uses very agile methods and even uses a lot of DevOps ideas. They don't even call it that, but that's what they're doing. And one very prominent feature of how things work there is that the activity is conversation-based instead of process-centric. They have process, but what happens is issues arise and they don't wait for process. They right away reach out to who needs to know. And then other people get involved. And then they have high quality discussions. That's a key thing. And that's why we believe in techniques like Socratic inquiry and appreciative conversations. It's very important to be able to have high quality discussions about complex issues and rapidly coalesce toward a solution that is worth trying. The link between constructive agility and Agile 2, you can think of Agile 2 as a collection of agility promoting behaviors for an organization, and constructive agility is a kind of roadmap for how you can start applying those. It doesn't say be agile in this way, but it's kind of, think of it as like steps, that you would go through in developing your own process. Agile 2 is a more nuanced model for agility promoting behavior than the original Agile. The problem with the original Agile is not that it was wrong, but in order to use those ideas well, because they're expressed kind of like bumper stickers. And so, we all know if you read a bumper sticker, usually you nod your head, well, depending, but, if a bumper sticker says, peace is better than war, well, yeah, who wouldn't agree with that? But the real world's more complicated. So if you just apply it in an absolute, it probably doesn't work. And that's where the Agile Manifesto and the Agile movement kind of went wrong. These kind of overly simplistic notions that people then took to the extreme and applied as absolutes, when really to apply those ideas actually requires a lot of experience and sophisticated, nuanced judgment. So Agile 2, yeah.
Hey, Cliff.
Yeah.
Just to emphasize that point, when everybody uses that term Agile Manifesto, they don't use the full name of that. It's the Agile Manifesto for Software Development. It's just like calling the PMI's PMBOK, the PMBOK. No, it's the PMBOK guide.
Right.
It isn't the thing itself. So I think that really emphasizes your point. They did that in Snowbird specifically for software development, and it's been co-opted, shall we say, to
Yeah.
everything else and made into something it really isn't. So
Yeah.
I love you making that point.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah. And Agile 2 very explicitly is not just about software. You're completely right. The original Agile Manifesto was targeted at software, but Agile 2 is not. Agile 2 is broader, and that's one of the reasons why we chose SpaceX. We also look at Amazon and Netflix and Spotify and some others. And as I said, okay, I've already spoken to this. So agility really arises from culture, knowledge, and behavior, and process will follow. You need to define process, but process needs to be tailored to the situation. A very powerful example of that is at SpaceX. Early in the life cycle of the development of a vehicle, they have very little process. They have minimum. You need some, but they have minimal. But then when the vehicle gets close to flight certification, suddenly they add a lot of process. So they're intentional about their process. They don't start with a process, they end with a process. And just a quick snapshot of constructive agility. There's a website. We kind of make fun of SAFe here, and the SAFe is not all bad. SAFe has some good ideas in it. But what really is kind of broken is this idea that you can just copy their processes, and which they actually don't advocate, but that's actually how it ends up being used in almost every place I've ever seen. And we have this kind of 10-step thing, but it's a journey. And at every step, it asks you questions. Think about these things and think about these things. How would you design a process to consider these issues? And you end up defining strategies, and the strategies get elaborated along the way. And just to show an example of that, you develop strategies for people, for leadership, for development, and for funding, and for all these different things that are important and might be more important in certain situations than others. But you don't build it all out. You start with a seed and you evolve it over time, depending on what's happening and what your needs are. Okay, let me go back to this. Okay. And so it's a journey. Agility is always a journey. Starting and growing an initiative is always a journey. It's not something you can design completely up front. And that's the end of the talking heads. So someone actually sent us a question over the website. We put a form on the website in which someone could ask, and they asked this, so we'd like to respond to this, and then open it up. And we also have this list of questions that people typed in last time, and so we'll go to that if there aren't more questions from the group. So going back to this, the question was how to improve a learning process for new competencies to the entire organization through train the trainers approach. Stephen, maybe do you want to start off on that? I have a lot of thoughts, but I've been talking too much.
Okay. Yes, I think that learning really is a process that is experience, and it's applied to a specific situation. And as you develop it, you pick up wisdom. That's really what we're advocating in constructive agility, as opposed to just taking a process and applying it. And I think as you go through the process of learning and building new competencies, then you're able to share those with people. But the more experiential it is, the more question-based, the deeper the learning experience will be. So I'll hand it back to you, Cliff.
Sure, excellent. Yeah, and one thing you said I'd like to emphasize is the experiential part, because if we think back to how we've learned things professionally, it's really helpful to have foundational knowledge. There are mental models. And, that's like what you would learn in a textbook. If you were to read a book on leadership, for example, There are established models of leadership, path goal theory, LMX theory, and transformational leadership, and so on. But just reading about that doesn't make you a good leader. But it helps. It helps because now you have mental models that you can think about. And so when you're in a real situation, you try to use those, and you make intentional decisions about what to do. And then, those decisions are informed by your book knowledge. But the decisions that you make, those memories are what become the real knowledge. That becomes your predictive model in your head for outcomes. And so that making the choices and making the decisions and designing your process is how you actually learn. It's really crucial to design your own process, and doing so informed by models, because otherwise you're guessing. And then reflection on how it went, and that builds true knowledge and eventually, after time, hopefully wisdom. So to answer this, what we would say is that it's really important to have, actual training in the real stuff. And I don't consider someone's framework rules real stuff. It's not useless. It's very often helpful. But the real stuff is like learning, how leadership works, how human behavior works, and learning operations research patterns like flow and lean and so on. And learning those things that are broadly applicable. That's kind of the real knowledge, and that really should be the foundation for learning, and then the foundation for experience and trying those things over time. Okay, I'd like to open it up. We can come back to these, but because these were articulated by people who attended the webinar. But I'd like to see if okay, someone typed in, Ken Pugh typed in, please discuss the alternatives, picking people with the right behavior or having people with the right behavior.
That should be or training people to have the right behavior.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, growing people, for people, you have, recruiting, training, and retention. And, actually, Stephen, maybe you want to respond to that.
Well,
I'm putting you on the spot today. Sorry.
Thank you. So let me see if I understand the question correctly. Picking people with the right behavior or training people with the right behavior, was that the question?
Yep.
Yeah.
In other words,
okay.
Yep, exactly.
Well, these days, finding right people has become a difficult kind of thing. So, but I think your first option of finding people that already embody the right behavior is usually, I think, a better way to do that. But in the advent that you can't find that person, beginning to train them and mentor them. And I especially think, yes, we talked last week or the last webinar, where agility tends to break down is at the level of leadership. And it's really about the behaviors, it's about the communications. And as we've been saying, it's not a precise science. Sometimes it's better or worse in learning. And I think the same is true with people as you put them in that role, and trying to find the ways that they can be mentored either by the leadership, their co-workers, the team, into effectively working. So Cliff, looks like we're getting a lot of questions here now.
Yeah. So that mentorship and leadership that encourages the development of people. It's very important for, first of all, there are many kinds of leadership, and we need many. One doesn't suffice. Peter Drucker used to say you need an inside person, an outside person, and a person of action. And different situation calls for different kinds of leadership. And a very important aspect of inward focused leadership is developing people. And that's why your people strategy needs to really account for that. Do you grow them or do you bring them in? Well, it depends. If you think you can grow them, that's probably better. But then you also have to be able to recognize the right ones. It's very common that the most outspoken person who seems confident will be perceived as a natural leader, when in fact studies have shown that confidence has no correlation to correctness, none. So, we need to get good at, and the leadership workshop that we're actually developing right now with some partners is designed at some very specific aspects of leadership. And one of them is helping leaders to recognize the right people for roles. Very often on a team, in terms of like a team lead, someone who's soft-spoken and open and inclusive, but also is kind of a good decision maker, but stays in the background, that might be the best leader. It depends. So recognizing the right traits, and very often to recognize the right people, you have to be very participatory. If you're not there, seeing what's actually happening, you probably won't have a good picture. So it's challenging. It's a very challenging thing. What was one of the other questions? I think John asked, in addition to Agile 2, what books would this group recommend to obtain all the knowledge, for leadership theory, behavioral science, operations research, and cognitive? Yeah, and then Mark responded, how big's your book budget? Well, we would of course recommend ours, because, we did, we don't make a lot of money from this. This is a labor of love. I mean, it's done well, but I had a very successful IT book in the 90s, late 90s, that like was a bestseller. And I think I figured out that I made $5 an hour from that book. If I figured out how much time it took to write, because it was 800 pages. But anyway, it sold 6 times what was the norm for an IT book back then. But anyway, this book, Creating Constructive Cultures, by 2 of the founders of Human Synergistics, I would highly recommend, because the first 3 chapters, which were like, blew me away. They really explain kind of how culture manifests in complex organizations. And the rest of the book is all case studies, real case studies. They've worked with more than 30,000 organizations, so they have a lot of experience. So I highly recommend that book. And then I would also recommend, for the cognitive side, I would recommend Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, which is a very acclaimed book, but it's amazing. My wife's a behavioral therapist, and I gave her the book, and it like has changed her work. It's quite an amazing book. He wrote another one recently also called Noise, I believe, but I haven't got a chance to read that yet.
So Yuri has her hand up.
Oh, Yuri, yes. Hi, Yuri. What would you like to say?
Hi, everybody. It's actually good afternoon. So I was gonna piggyback on your statement about those quiet people on the background. I've seen quite a few, and I also seen those people that very vocal, and unfortunately they were wrong most of the time. So how would you, or what would you recommend actually to sort of level out, the ground and I wouldn't say subdue people that like to talk, but be not quite correct, and yet bring those people that really quiet, but on the background, but kind of right.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad you corrected. We don't want to subdue them, because it's, usually well-intentioned, not always, but usually people who are vocal, they're trying to share their thoughts. They're exuberant. They're what I call fast talkers. I have a colleague who's actually on our advisory board. Last night I had a conversation with her, and finally after an hour I said, Tricia, shut up. Let me get a word in. Now I've known her for a long time, so she laughed, but
my apology, Cliff, my apology. I didn't probably use the best word to describe, but I was just trying to articulate the activity. It's not really subdue, but but I hope you understand what I'm trying to articulate.
I do.
If I may, Cliff, I think relative to that, Yuri, a couple of things. One, you really need to make an effort to find a way to help everybody contribute. And one of the things that, may sound like it's anathema in this world where everybody seems prone to immediate action, is not to assume that a problem is going to be solved in one meeting. That sometimes you have to walk away and say, great, we've had a good discussion. Most everybody's managed to contribute. Let's pick this up in tomorrow or the next day, and let's give everybody a chance to think about it and come back. And a lot of people want to write. A lot of people just want to talk. And some number of people really don't want to collaborate at all. So you need, if you're mindfully working in that context, somehow you can end up separating the influence of people that are fast talkers and prevent them from keeping people who are not necessarily verbal or verbally inclined from participating.
Yeah, very well said. It depends on the situation. Actually, one of the situations in the Agile 2 training, one of the scenarios that we consider is a case where there's a group, and at first the group is able to have very good dialogues, but then someone leaves and is replaced by two others. And then the dialogue really degrades because those two become an inner circle. And they kind of unintentionally, it's all benign, unintentionally don't let others in. And the challenge in this workshop session in the Agile 2 training is, what should the team lead do? What kind of intervention? And we always open that up for discussion. And, we realize pretty quickly in the discussion that it depends on so many things. The right solution depends on the individuals. So as Howard said, it is the goal is not to make people be quiet. The goal is to get everybody's brain. And, sometimes, you see people who are quiet in a meeting, that doesn't mean they have nothing to say. It could mean a couple things. It could mean they don't like talking with a group. It's kind of not their thing, or it could mean they're still thinking. It could mean, and a lot of people don't really mentally process something until later after the meeting. It's not that they're slow. It's that, they don't say what they think right away. They hold on to it and they go over it and they reflect. They kind of go to a deeper level, not because they're smarter, but because they go to system 2 thinking, as Daniel Kahneman describes it, right away. And so if you force those people to make an agreement in a meeting, they'll often regret it. They'll agree, and then afterwards they'll feel, oh my God, I agreed to something I actually, now on reflection, I think it was the wrong choice. So, on the one hand, you can't speed up how people think. But on the other hand, you do need to keep things moving. You can't try to always make sure everybody's certain and there's always consensus. You have to decide when to end and when to decide to at least try something. And that's a judgment call that someone in a facilitating or a leadership role often has to make.
So we had a lot of discussion in the last meeting about blockers to agility, and there was a lot of discussion about middle management and leadership. And I want to ask the group, I know some of you here were fairly vocal about that. If you have a question or an observation that you'd like to make, please share it.
I've been writing a series of pieces that I've been posting on LinkedIn about why can't my organization grow and improve. And the very first part of that was it had to do with blockers or barriers to change. And I actually listed 5 when I did the presentation and then did the article. And absence of trust was one that comes from John, that comes from Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team. It's a very base level thing. the lack of a cohesive vision for the organization. This comes from Andrew Kahneman, late Ted Kahneman's flow, their unified vision framework, but that vision at the top that is very clear, consistent, cohesive, and constantly communicated downward, much like you've been saying with Agile too. You don't have that, you end up in deep water pretty quickly. A general unaware of the stagnant state of things, the status quo is the number one enemy out there. Salespeople will tell you they will lose out to the status quo more often than they lose out to a competitor. They think change has to be complicated or difficult when what it actually is hard. And those that realize it's hard sometimes want to shy away from that. And then you have just flat out complacency, either active or passive. It goes back to the status quo that, we're okay where we are. Well, if you're okay where you are, that's fine, but don't complain when you can't change, you can't ascend the maturity model on that. So those are a couple of the blockers and barriers in general that I think happen. And a lot of those, Cliff, to your point, feedback to leadership just isn't looking at it. Leadership isn't leading. They're not casting that vision, reinforcing it, and really supporting the kind of change and agility and movement that you need to build on.
Yeah. Yeah, very well said. There's kind of an assumption, that's being corrected, and the Agile community, began as kind of an anarchist movement in a sense. And, I remember well, it was a response to enormous dysfunction, that we had these big heavyweight projects and autocratic leadership and, big documents. And so the Agile movement was kind of like, wait, forget that, and it was very kind of anti-leadership. And, that's kind of been corrected. If you look at what's been written in the last 10 years, leadership's come back. If you look at IC Agile's curriculum, they have an entire business agility curriculum that's almost all about leadership. If you read Nicole Forsgren's best-selling book, Accelerate, as a whole chapter on leadership. If you look at the DevOps Agile Skills Association curriculum, they have a whole curriculum on leadership. If you look at Dave Marquette's book, Turn the Ship Around, one of the best-selling Agile books, it's all about leadership. That's really what the book's all about. And all the things that you listed, the only people who can really change those things are the people who have leadership roles, because it takes coordination, it takes, asking the right questions, it takes empowering individuals, it takes, someone to be nudging things and moving them and making the conversations happening. That's leadership. And leadership is not always positional authority. It can be someone who stands up and says, let's do this, but in an organization, people are busy. And, usually it does take someone who has an actual role, a leadership role, to kind of get people's attention and say, okay, put your pencils down. We need to deal with this issue. We need to reorganize how we're doing stuff. It has to be someone who has kind of, the backing of senior leadership to get people to reprioritize. So, but the thing is, it has to be positive leadership. If it's toxic leadership, then that's even worse than no leadership. So we have to differentiate between the, the autocratic toxic leadership, that really was kind of an inspiration for the Agile Manifesto, versus good leadership, which is actually what makes an organization really excel.
Cliff, one more, one thing, it's probably worth mentioning how crucially important context is. The Agile software development team, or if it's connected, say, to a product team, may exist in a bubble, and it's in a relationship with the more senior management of the company will determine a lot about how well change can be accommodated. I've written in a number of places that if you wrap something that's agile in something that's not agile, the result is not agile. And you've probably all heard the term water scrum fall, but that's exactly what happens. So you can develop and optimize within the context of a constrained agility situation. But if you really want to become agile and achieve business agility, the whole management structure of the enterprise needs to be reoriented. And if you are stuck in a situation of you're doing essentially what are scrum fall projects, then you need to sort of scale down your ambitions.
Yeah, absolutely. And like a gentleman a few minutes ago, and I couldn't see who was talking, so I don't know who it was, but was mentioning, you know, a lack of vision. You know, it was the one who listed the 5 things. You know, it's up to leadership to take the initiative to articulate it. It doesn't have to be all their ideas, but someone needs to get it going. You know, and someone needs to say, okay, we've talked about it enough. Oh, thank you, Mark. It was Mark. Well, let's look at, you know, some of the other questions that people have asked, and all of you have priority. We'll skip these if someone states something in the chat or raises your hand. We don't need to go through all these. So someone mentioned culture and disconnect between leadership and teams delivering. Well, the linkage with culture is interesting. And the reason that we partnered with Human Synergistics is because we realized that the agility promoting behaviors that are identified in Agile 2 rely on having a constructive culture. And we've actually been able to identify which cultural traits can block which kinds of behaviors. So for example, if one of your goals in your organization is to have open and honest discussions about issues, then we know based on statistical data that a culture that fosters internal competition will basically shut that down. You won't have honest, open discussions about issues if you have an internally competitive culture. So, you know, so it's really important for organizations to also think about their culture and be intentional about it and think about how they can shift the culture, which is very possible. It is possible to shift your culture. You can't change everything overnight, but if with persistence and advocacy and demonstration, and also some restructuring of incentives and restructuring of things, you can start to shift your culture. People wait and see if it's real. But if they see that it's persistent and they see 6 months go by and they're still hearing the same messaging, and they see the executives are actually demonstrating those behaviors, and they see structures change, incentives change, and they hear it's still being advocated and talked about, and they see the movement, they start to pay attention and they start to try and behave that way. You know, and then that behavior becomes the norm, and it becomes the expectation, and then it becomes part of the new culture. So you know, because changing culture is so hard, you don't want to change the whole culture. You want to be tactical and identify what aspects of the culture are blocking the agility behaviors, and then focus on those, and then reflect, and then broaden, you know, and approach that in an agile way as well. Someone also wrote last time, work and meetings through Zoom. Leaders need to learn new ways to connect with their people since work from home. We actually have a training course on this, like a lot of people, about remote work. But one of the core things is that you have to be more proactive. You know, you can't manage by walking around, because there is no around. Everybody is somewhere else. And the world's going global. Work is going global. There's no going back. It's not really about return to office and remote's better, worse. Work's going global. So you can't do global in the same office. The future is global. And you go far enough, we'll have, who knows, we'll have, don't take this literally, at least not for the next decade or two, but we may have people even on the moon someday. We need to think globally. We need to untether ourselves from a location and a time zone. And so what does that look like? And it has a huge impact on leadership because, it means that you can't like go up to someone's desk and say, how are you doing? So what do? You have to check in with people, proactively. How are you doing? You also have to look at the actual work, which is something I think is really important, even when you're in an office. Looking at the actual work, not to criticize it, but just to see what's going on. But definitely being more proactive is really important. And the FaceTime is important too. So in the course of creating Agile 2, it involved 15 people, and it was done during the pandemic. The team was global. We never met in person. It was all through Zoom and Slack and Google Docs and emails. And the Zoom meetings, we ended up having mostly one-on-one Zoom meetings because it was too impractical to schedule group Zoom meetings with 15 people. So we ended up having lots of one-on-ones, and people took notes, very detailed notes, unopinionated notes, just recording what others thought. And then we shared those in emails and in shared documents. And then we would take issues from the emails and move them into documents that were issue focused. So a key aspect of this is something that Howard talks a lot about, is kind of architecting the conversations. But architecting it in an experimental way, where someone takes the lead and says, well, let's try it this way, and then sees how that works, and then adjust it. And if someone has a better idea, then you try that. But there has to be initiative and leadership happening, no matter where it's coming from, happening about, how are we organizing our discussions? What's working? How are we combining our ideas and finding the overlap, and that's distilling the issues that we need to then talk through to peel the onion. We ended up with the two issues that ended up being real sticking points were leadership style and the whole introvert versus extrovert collaboration style. We ended up having so many deep discussions with emails nested 15 levels deep, and then we had Google Docs where all of those thoughts got put into and distilled into a hierarchy of issues, and then discussed again and again until people merged their thinking. And that took a lot of work to manage that, to do that constant synthesis. It took a lot of work. So anyway, would love to know others' thoughts and experiences on that.
We're getting a lot of play on culture. And
Yeah.
Jen, I want to ask you if you'd like to speak up to the group about that, or would you like us to speak to your thoughts on culture?
I think Jen is having a problem getting unmuted or getting her microphone working properly.
Okay.
So unfortunately, we're probably not going to hear her voice on this subject, but.
Did she write enough to be able to express her thought for her?
Well,
let's see if she comes back. John's got his hand up right now, and
Okay.
then so Go ahead, John.
Hi, John.
Hey, Cliff. Hi, everybody. Thank you. So actually, I want to point out, Doug had asked a question about too much work in progress being a blocker. And my question is kind of related to that. I'd watched the YouTube video of the June 1st conversation and really liked the slide. It was around 9 minutes where it had leadership theory, behavioral science, those 4 points. And I guess my question is, so I think it's kind of related to Doug, are each of those points, and especially operations research in particular, because I think that's very far afield from what I do, are each of those necessary in order to truly be agile? If a culture doesn't understand, if an organization where I work is a medical specialty society, has absolutely nothing to do with where Agile, DevOps, Flow all came from, but I'm finding it very relevant. If my organization, my company doesn't actually buy into implementing those ideas, is agility going to be essentially impossible to achieve? If I can't point to, hey, we have too much work in progress and we have to pare that down, as Doug said, slow down to speed up, do I have to get them to buy into those ideas in order to actually be able to achieve agility, or is there a way around it?
Well, it's kind of, yeah, I mean, the good news is, it always depends. But that's also bad news too, because there's no like clear answer. But, it's never absolute. It's like, it's not absolute, oh, you have agility or you don't. It's always a matter of degree. And, agility is not the only goal. You also want to have efficacy. Anyone can produce junk really fast. Agility is the ability to pivot, but, pivot well. Yes, have conversations that get resolved in a timely way, but that also lead to a good decision. If the conversations are shallow, then you wrap them up quickly, but you won't reach a good decision a lot of the time. So, these things, Agile 2 was an attempt to be kind of less, kind of just some people's idea and more grounded in what we actually know about human behavior. And that, so that's the reason for behavioral psychology and leadership theory and operations research. And, because those are real things. We know things definitively about those subjects. And so, does someone have to be an expert in all those things? Definitely not. But there are ideas from those subject areas that often are very helpful. So like operations research, which actually happens to be something that I studied in grad school, has really the foundation of lean and flow ideas. I mean, you can model lean and flow situations using operations research models. But, the point is not the models. The point is, the mental ideas of, the idea of a critical path is often a very helpful idea. The idea of reducing work in process is often a very helpful idea. Those are ideas that we can apply. And so I would suggest not being like, say, oh, you have to learn all this stuff. I definitely wouldn't take that approach. I would learn as much as I could myself, but then look at the situation and pick out the techniques and ideas that I think would help, and then advocate for those and start discussions, open discussions about those. And just a tip on that you may also know is always start a discussion open. Like, what do you think is the real problem here? And then, get what other people think, and then bring in the Agile idea. But yeah, definitely don't scare them with this big learning map of everything they have to know before they can get started.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And actually, I appreciate the idea of starting with what do you think is the problem? Because that has not been my approach the last few months, but I think so thank you for the reminder.
Sure, yeah, we all have to remind ourselves sometimes. I mentioned I had a conversation last night with someone who normally is very much like that, but last night she was doing all the talking, and finally I had to tell her to be quiet. But anyway.
So I'd like to kind of piggyback on what you said, Cliff. I've been having these conversations for many years with lots of leaders, and I've always found a good starting place is where they have problems or frustrations, and trying to understand more about those, and then positioning them to maybe experiment and try a new methodology or technique or method for managing that. And so you don't need to get a lot from them to be able to move forward. Just an openness and a curiosity. And even if they think you're going to fail, they generally will let you try. And then as you show what's possible, then they begin to shift their opinion and become more of a promoter and sponsor for that activity.
Going on to, unless someone else has, oh, someone's wrote to pile on. Mark wrote, there's a concept of unlearning that really has come first, often skipped. It's the way we go back and examine our bad habits and plot. Yeah, definitely reflect. And that's how you acquire wisdom, reflecting on what you've done wrong in the past. We have all have a lot of reflection to do, I'm sure.
And then it's a choice to do something different, Cliff.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I have one other thing to add here, Cliff. One of the things that has to happen in order for companies and groups and teams to become agile is you have to learn to work from a shallower base of certainty. A lot of people are not ready to, to set off on a path until they think that they've planned the whole thing out. And that's just as anti-agile as it gets.
Yeah.
So, kind of what you need to do is to act more like a basketball team than a baseball team. A baseball team is all the guys in the field are standing out there. And if the guy, if the batter strikes out, they have nothing to do. On the other hand, the basketball is always going up and down the court and people are moving around and repositioning themselves and all that. You really have to teach people how to operate with lower levels of certainty, which means you need to clearly articulate the goals and revise them when the situation requires it, and make them realize that you're operating in an approach of successive approximation rather than a linear journey.
Yeah.
And if people are going to continue to operate like, I have a set of recs, I'm going to build this thing, I'm going to get to the end of the sprint, I'm going to test it, turn it in, and then, I'm done until the next sprint. Ultimately, that's not really going to provide you with agility.
Yeah, that's actually really, go ahead, Stephen, go ahead.
Just in the interest of time here, I'm going to ask if you could jump to slide 20 and we can talk more about communication and culture.
Tell me, is it this one or before it?
Let's see. Keep going. It was slide number 20. It was the next one after this. So Cliff and I wrote an article that was put on LinkedIn last week, and it was brought up by how the conversations that we typically have in a lot of frameworks that we use are really somewhat depreciative. There's a wonderful book here that I recommend called Conversations Worth Having. It's about appreciative inquiry, but if you could go back to that slide, is generally in a lot of the frameworks that we have where we're reviewing a project or a process, it's very much statement-based instead of inquiry-based. And as a consequence, what happens, and I think in leadership where we have issues, is where they devalue a situation, person, or opportunity, or blame others. They tend to weaken the connection, tends to reinforce the status quo, strains relationship, limits possibility. On the other hand, when we're more inquiry-based, we allow people to share ideas, expand their awareness, gain new knowledge, generate possible solutions, deepen connections, and enhance relationships. If you could go to the model just before this one, Cliff. We're going to have, in our next webinar, we're really going to talk about communication and culture. And the idea, if you want to change the culture, you change the conversation. We're going to spend some time really looking at this model of how to do this and how powerful this can be to open up the organization to change and to really bring out the best in people. And as that starts to take hold in the organization, it really will help promote agility. So I just wanted to bring up this point. I think it's a key one, that communication is really the essential part of leadership, and teaching leaders, if you want to be agile, to have a different type of conversation and a different appreciation for the ability of people in the organization to help you change the culture and become more agile.
Yeah, actually, where's the slide? I like this slide, and you know, I haven't worked for Elon Musk, so I don't know what he's like, but you know, I have interviewed people who did work for him recently, and they confirm he is a little scary. So this whole thing of safety, I don't know, but I mean, in terms of, I don't know if I'd want to work there, but there is one trait that's really powerful that happens there, and that we verified this, that it's not just a one-off, that it's a very conversation-based environment, that you never go wrong by saying what you honestly think. The way you go wrong in that organization is if you say you're sure about something, but you're actually not sure. But if you say you're not sure and explain why, it's never a mistake. And you know, this picture is Elon Musk and the person who leads the development of the booster that they're designing, which is kind of a young guy. But you know, the interactions are very fluid. You know, they don't have a like designed process. You know, they're changing the design all the time, and they have kind of a rule of thumb where if they're 51% certain that something will work, they feel they're ready to try it. And what that does is it creates an environment of safety, a feeling of safety, because you don't have to be right. It's expected that 49% of the time you'll be wrong. It's expected. You know, that's the norm. So, you know, so that aspect of that Howard mentioned of not trying to be certain, but just trying to get a point where you feel you know enough to try something, and then having a dialogic, you know, an appreciative inquiry-based approach, which they apparently do have, about the issues. So it's always conversation-based and issue-based rather than process-based. So that's one of the reasons why we feel that this, you know, conversation-based appreciative inquiry, and what we also in our training refer to as Socratic inquiry, is so pivotal for leaders in agile organizations. You know, Elon Musk aside, you know, being conversation-based and using appreciative inquiry is a really powerful leadership style.
So just as a process check, we're approaching the 10 o'clock mark. Doug put a point in that I want to share, that he said an impressive consultant that he liked had a tagline in the signature, "I could be wrong." So just to amplify.
Yeah,
so,
excellent.
So we, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
We really appreciate your participation here today. We hope you found this to be helpful. We're looking forward to creating more of these webinars that we'll do, but also having follow-ons where we can have discussion. We're also in the process of creating a more of a virtual community to have those. You'll hear more about that later on, but we very much value your feedback. If you have thoughts, suggestions, criticisms, please let us know those. And go ahead, Cliff.
Yeah, I was going to say what you just said, even better. So thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure, and please reach out to us if there's anything you'd like to discuss about any of this.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.